But yeah, that's as a kind of first explanation of the process. That's the idea. So I'm going to look at through the rest of the workshop. We're going to look at slightly different tree shapes and also look at groups of trees. And when we're working with groups of trees, we're sort of applying the same principle but simplifying things even further. So as I say, this is sort of a mid-ground tree, moderately close to us. So, I'm almost focused in on that tree, but the tree's really far back. So these ones in the distance would need to. Oh, sorry, I'll zoom back out a bit. These ones in the distance would need to be more simplified than a tree like this. If they were further in the background, because we generally want to be able to give a sense of things in the midground have a certain level of detail, and then things that go further back get less complex. They feel like they're further away, we can't quite make them out. And when they get really close, they get much more detailed. But yeah, that's the basic process. So to sort of recap it, we've got the kind of finding the initial shape. So we started with that initial egg shape, sitting on top of the trunk, which was kind of like an upside down or a V shape that was sort of holding it up. We then thought about where the light was coming from, so that allowed us to find the shadows and find the lights. And we put that in very simply. Then we started to break into that shape to find the edges, so the edge of the tree, the edge of the shadow, and then we started to put a little bit of variation within the shadows, and just kind of carry on adding more kind of detail to the edges. But I've not done an enormous amount of anything within the shadow or within the lights. I've focused more kind of in this band primarily, and also the edge of the tree. So this is a fairly kind of rough version of it, but it gives you the idea. And beyond this point, it's just a case of kind of continuing this process, so going in and kind of neatening things out and adding more detail, so looking for more specific kind of edges and different shapes that you might find in those leaves. But the basic principle can then be applied to other trees. So I'm just going to go through. So this one, for instance, I won't actually draw this one out because it's a really similar shape. But if we think about this one as well, there's not such a strong kind of light form or kind of form evident, because the light, it's like an overcast day, so we've got a sort of softer light on the tree. But we can definitely make out that this bottom left-hand corner is just generally a bit darker than the top right-hand corner, so we can kind of infer that the light's coming kind of from above and to the right a little bit. And so generally, if we were drawing this tree, we would maybe put that shadow edge sort of along there, but it would be a kind of more gradual process of putting in those jagged edges, and generally they'll get a bit lighter at the top. What would be really important with this tree is we've got this very strong border around it, where the white kind of overcast sky is meeting the tree edge, and we could pretty much get away with this tree just focusing on this edge here, so looking for what the shape of the tree is, finding a few of these little kind of light sky holes. So there's a bit more, well, because the sky is so bright behind, we can see more of these sky holes showing through. So I would say with this one, if your focus was just on that general form, making sure you've got a kind of darker, generally quite dark tones down in this lower portion of the tree, finding a nicely specific edge, so looking for the edge of the leaves, so where it kind of goes in and out, and finding some of those sky holes from a distance in a painting or a drawing, that would read pretty nicely as a tree. But again, it's that process of looking for its basic shape, so it's almost a little bit like a squashed egg as well, this one. And that would be your starting point. We're going to go back to these later. So again, this is a similar form. I won't do this one either because it's quite similar to the one that we've done, but it's got this one has a very obvious edge to its shadow. So again, it's probably illuminated a bit more to the left, so we've got a shadow that kind of goes to the right of it rather than directly below like the one we were just working on. So maybe a lower sun that's hitting it, but a very definite shadow edge that we can find. So if we follow that same process, it's a little bit more like almost like a like a rugby ball shape or something like that. This one, not quite as round or eggy, so it kind of goes up to a point. If I was to draw it, its basic shape, I'd maybe think of it a little bit more like this. So that sort of shape with the trunk below. So that'll be our starting point with this one. It's not quite the same shape, but it's similar. So from there, again, we would find this shadow edge, so the irregularity of the shadow edge, the edge around the tree, and any of these little, this one again has a few more sky holes. It's the land showing behind, but gaps in the foliage that we could find and take out. So yeah, just the same process we'd be following with this one. So I'm going to have a look at this one next, because it starts to go into how we would maybe have to think about the tree forms if there were no leaves at all. So if we were just looking at the sort of the trunk and the branches of the tree, rather than the leaves. And generally I would say it's a bit easier to draw a tree that doesn't have leaves, because you do basically just have to kind of track all the different changes in direction. I'm just going to tilt down a little bit more. But with this one, my starting point would still be similar. So even though we've got the trunk kind of splitting and going in a lot of different directions, generally everything is still sort of constrained within a similar sort of shape to the shapes that we've been dealing with, but it has more gaps between all of the smaller kind of clumps of leaves. But if we were to throw a net over all of it, we would probably still end up with a similar sort of egg shape, even though it seems like it's maybe a bit more irregular or a bit different to the ones that we've just been looking at. So let's go through this one. So again, I'm starting at thinking of it as a sort of slightly squashed egg shape. And again, its trunk, we don't quite see the bottom where it meets the landscape, but the trunk makes a sort of V shape. This is pretty standard. It makes sense that this is how a tree like this, how its trunk would work, because its trunk has to branch up, and the branches eventually have to reach kind of far enough in all the different directions to kind of be holding these leaves. If the trunk just went straight up, you wouldn't have any way for the leaves to be held in place. So everything sort of hovers around the trunk form, which is very obvious in this particular one because we can see where the trunk's kind of moving through the tree. So again, really simply, it's this sort of shape, this V shape coming up. So that's it, trying to distill it to its kind of most simple version. And if we're thinking about the light again, we can sort of see that the leaves are generally lighter in this one on the right hand side. So we've got light coming from fairly high above, not quite as high as this one, but from the right as well. So generally, as all the forms turn away, we can see it in these trunks. The left hand edge of the trunk is darker than the right hand edge. The right hand edge is illuminated all the way through those trunks. The left hand edge is darker. And the same thing is happening to the leaves. So in these smaller clumps, we can sort of see the right hand edge of them is lighter, and the right hand edge, the left hand edge is darker, and the right hand edge is lighter. So with this one, rather than jumping straight into the edge, we're going to have to kind of find sort of medium clumps, medium forms of foliage within this kind of larger shape. So this is obviously one quite big group. So that might be that sort of shape there. Got another group that sits over the top. Another group here. I'm not too fussed about being super neat. It's gonna, whenever I draw trees, it's, as I say, I'm going for more of a kind of ragged edge, because there aren't, with the exception of the trunks, there aren't any super smooth edges. And then we've got a few kind of smaller forms. We're not going for the really tiny ones just yet, but this one's reasonably dominant form in there. Another form here. So, zoom in a little bit, make sure that's focused on the side I'm drawing. And I then want to just find, in this case, what the trunks are doing, what the trunk is doing. Particularly the parts of the trunk that connect to these major groups. And I want to look for the rhythm within the trunks. So I don't want it to be too regular, so I want some parts of the trunks to be longer, some parts shorter, and try to observe that. So this is an instance where I would say you want to pay fairly close attention to what you're looking at. Not necessarily exactly copy all of the lengths and measurements, but make sure you don't start to get too repetitive with your lengths of trunks. So you want sort of, usually you get a shorter length, a longer length, a shorter length. Is more naturalistic. So as I say, I'm just looking for where this is branching. Obviously, the further away it gets from the bottom of the trunk, the thinner the branches will get. So as they go higher up here, they're getting thinner. And I'm not going for any of the really tiny trunks yet, or tiny branches coming off the main trunk. I'm focusing on these bigger sections, just like we focus on the big form of the tree before we start to go in with lots of detail in the leaves. I'm mainly looking at where the trunk is moving relative to those big groups, those clumps that I initially put in. I've got this other side because below the line of sight we've got an even bigger trunk.
I was just thinking at this point I would be in danger of obsessing over being seduced by all the little detail once I start looking at the nuances and angles of the trunk. I'm wondering, what advice you've got to just keep you focused on the most efficient way of doing
it. Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, this is one of the main sort of problems generally with trees is they are just a super complex thing. Like, they're one of the most complex things that you have to draw, really. If you're looking at most other forms in the landscape are simpler than that. Things like I mean, clouds can be complex, but generally they've got a bit more of an obvious continuous form. You know, grasses from a distance will kind of turn into whatever the land, however the landscape is undulating. Bushes are a little bit more like trees. When you draw bushes, I would approach them the same way though.
Okay.
But yeah, certainly this type of tree I would say is pretty challenging to simplify. So that one of the reasons why I picked it is it's a sort of trickier than something like this. I would say it's easier to simplify something like that, but kind of figuring out the level at which to kind of break it down, as you say, is tricky.
Okay.
So certainly a starting point, as I say, rather than going for the trunk first, I went for the groups of kind of foliage as my starting point.
Yeah.
They're quite faintly drawn in now, but they were my starting point rather than the tree trunk. I think if I was to go, if you were to go in for the tree trunk first, that would kind of exacerbate that problem of trying to get too much detail in too quickly. So by putting the big clumps in, then what I'm thinking about is which branches kind of go up to that clump, what's holding that clump of leaves up. And then that's how I kind of pick my dominant kind of bits of trunk. Because there are sections where, you know, that aren't doing as much to contribute to holding up these groups of leaves. So there's a few kind of twisty little bits of branch that they don't necessarily seem to be doing as much. So the ones I'm choosing are the ones that I feel like are doing more to connect to those forms that are already in place, those foliage forms or leaf forms. Generally, I mean, that's the same as how I would approach drawing almost anything. So if you're doing a portrait, you sort of go back to the fundamental anatomy, or you sort of think of the really basic forms in the face and how they connect together. So isolated things, if you find a form that doesn't connect to other forms in the drawing, it's not as useful, or it doesn't work as effectively as if it connects to something. Because the whole drawing, when you're working naturalistically, you want everything to connect together, like it has a purpose and it links to something else. So if you can think of it that way, you've got your kind of foliage shapes, and then how are all these kind of trunk and branch shapes moving around and connecting them. So at the moment, for instance, this one here, it doesn't, I can't, you know, it's not entirely clear which branches are holding that up, whereas this one, I have these two little branches, it feels like it's kind of being held up, it's got something supporting it. Or this one down here, it feels already like it's supported, or this one. So, you know, at this stage, I'd say probably all I'm missing is a little section of trunk that connects this clump here, and then maybe just a kind of another section that curves around and meets the center of this one.
Okay, so when you've got a tree that's got complex detail in it,
Yeah.
branches, trunks, which is easy to get seduced by, you just focus on the most important pieces relevant to the overall tree.
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, yeah. Yeah, so it's sort of like, it's almost like function over form to a certain extent with it. So what's actually kind of structurally important for the tree? And as I say, that applies to anything I would say that you draw when you're working not if you're working in a kind of, obviously, an expressionist way, or there's lots of other ways that you can create art that aren't as sort of, don't need to be as structurally sound as representational drawing and painting, or kind of academic or classical drawing and painting. But if you're going for this sort of look, you always sort of have to think about like the solidity of the structure that you're drawing. A really good figure drawing, it feels like there's weight to the figure, like the figure's actually putting weight on the ground, the way that they're standing and everything. You know, they're not feeling like they're tilting sideways or backwards. And the tree's the same, so you want it to kind of feel like the trunks and the branches are moving up through the air, and it's connecting to these leaves and it's holding them in place. And there isn't too much detail on one side and not enough on the other. That's your sort of primary concern. Certainly when you first start, as you start to render it, then you can get into like more expressive brushwork, or you can mess around with colors or those sorts of things. But for this initial kind of block-in stage, you're kind of focused on trying to make sure it feels solid and it makes sense the way everything's connecting, and it relates to the
that
light
makes
in the
sense.
same way.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible to see figure drawing where not all the detail is included, but there's enough to give you the sense of rhythm and form and poetry of the figure. So maybe a bit like that, really.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think of it really similarly. So, as I say, there's this kind of rhythm that you get through tree branches, and different trees have different rhythms. So when you draw paint a tree, you'll find that the branches will grow in a kind of, obviously like a pine tree has this sort of, it goes straight. It's got its main central trunk, like a straight pine tree, main central trunk that then branches off, and the branches are kind of longer at the bottom, and then they get shorter gradually at the top, and that's what creates that cone shape. Whereas this sort of tree, it grows in a much more irregular way, and so it creates what seem like more erratic shapes. But there's a rhythm to it, or there's kind of like a logic behind its chaos. It's something to do with the way it's interacting with the light, the way it interacts with trees around it, and it creates these really interesting rhythms. And really good figure drawing explores those rhythms in the human form, because the human form is complex and has lots of curves and straight bits. And if you think of like a finger's a little bit like a branch. So it's sort of that section of my finger is well, actually, so this section is usually about 2/3 of that length, and then this length is about 2/3 of that length, which creates a nice rhythm to the way that hands look. And if you draw hands, and you pay attention to that, you don't just kind of evenly divide the knuckles, so it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, which will look wrong. But you find that, there's that rhythm where that length is that much relative to that length, is that much relative to that length. And a similar sort of thing happens when you look at a tree trunk. So a tree trunk it'll have like a big section that'll go up, and then that'll angle off, and it'll get a bit, as I say, a bit more slender. Then the branches that come off that will kind of move in a similar sort of way, so they'll be longer, and then they'll get shorter, and they'll get thinner, and it kind of all goes out into almost like little tendrils, or you know what I mean? Which is weirdly similar to, I don't know if you've ever been to the Hunterian in London. It's like a museum of anatomical curiosities, I suppose.
What's it called?
The Hunterian. There's one in Glasgow as well, I think, actually. So there's some guy called Hunter who set it up, but it's just got loads of anatomical specimens and bits of human body, mostly about the human body, some animals as well. But there's a few sections which are central, what are they there? Circulatory systems of animals. And the circulatory systems of animals look exactly like trees. So the way that they branch out, they've got the major arteries are like the trunks, and then can't remember what, I know the tiniest bits are brachioles, but I can't remember what vein, I guess, like the vascular system. So the veins are kind of like the branches that come off the major branches that come off the arteries, and then the really tiny bits are like the brachioli or whatever, the same. I mean, lungs look the same as well if you think of how a lung looks, but they grow in a really similar form to trees, and trees are basically doing the same thing. They're transferring energy through the leaf system down into the tree. So that's where you get this rhythm and this strength from.
So life's life.
Yeah, it's interesting, all these kind of repeating patterns that you get. Not super relevant actually to simplifying trees, but it's an interesting thing. But yeah, you get, the more you do observational work and you look at loads of different things, you start to see how they're so similar to each other, which is quite interesting. So I've pretty much filled out this this trunk and branch system to a reasonable level now. So I'd say I've got, as I was saying, most of the major trunks and branches that connect and reach these clumps of leaves. So the next thing I would want to do is just go a little bit more definite, but also a bit more specific with the edges of these clumps of leaves. I'll probably zoom in actually, because you don't necessarily need that reference up while I'm working. So I manually focus because it's a bit more reliable than my. Tilt up a little bit. So I'm generally just looking for maybe where, the edge of the leaves goes down. Certainly looking for sky holes in this one, so it's a lot less dense. The leaves, there are a lot more places where the sky shows through behind. So I can pop them in as well. And you can see I'm allowing my application to be fairly erratic, so I'm not worrying too much if my hand's kind of wobbling about or I'm kind of creating more irregular shapes, because all that just helps to capture the irregularness of the leaves. But yeah, what's really tricky, I think, one thing that's tricky about trees is they adhere to a system, but then they vary a lot within that system that they adhere to. So to try to capture the feeling of them properly without them starting to feel like you're making them too geometric or too regular, that doesn't capture their character is quite difficult. I'd say generally with landscapes, that's probably one of the main. There's a lot of stuff that's quite easy about landscapes. One thing that's difficult is it's quite tempting, or we easily fall back on making things really regular, so making things symmetrical, or creating undulations in hills where the hills just kind of go like this, rather than kind of looking for where the hill goes up and then maybe curves down a little bit and then it gets longer or goes flat over the top and drops down, and you get more irregular. They look like waves, but you get more irregular shapes. And most people's brains always want to kind of make things regular, so we start to look for patterns, and our hand starts to do the same thing, almost like if you were hitting a drum. It's a little bit like, I think it's maybe like a musical thing, but you start to kind of do things in a repeated fashion, and it takes quite a lot of energy. I think why it's quite tiring to do observational drawing and painting. It takes a lot of energy to stop that and try to still focus in on what you're looking at and find that variety that's there.